You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Kayak gets my flight, hotel, and rental car right, so I can tune out travel advice that's just plain wrong.
Bro, SkyCoin. Way better than points.
Never fly during a Scorpio full moon.
Just tell the manager you'll sue. Instant room upgrade.
Stop taking bad travel advice. Start comparing hundreds of sites with Kayak and get your trip right.
Bad advice? You talking to me?
Kayak. Got that right.
Picture this. Me, Reese Witherspoon, in London, ordering fish and chips so often they might start wrapping me in paper. I'm traveling with my Wells Fargo Autograph Journey card, so I earn rewards wherever I book travel. 5 times points with hotels, 4 times with airlines, 3 times on restaurants and other travel, and 1 point on other purchases. Imagine getting rewarded for eating a toad in the hole. Wait, what is a toad in a hole?
Visit wellsfargo.com/autograph journey. Terms apply.
Hello everyone and welcome to History of the Second World War, episode 257, Crete Part 2, May 20th at Maleme. This week, a big thank you goes out to Ken for the donation on Buy Me a Coffee. As a reminder, this podcast is 100% powered by coffee. And to Anita, Gerald, Ross, Greg, and Axel for supporting the podcast by becoming members. Members get access to ad-free versions of all of the podcast episodes, plus special member-only episodes roughly once a month. Head on over to historyofthesecondworldwar.com/members to find out more. At dawn on May 20th, 1941, the German invasion of Crete would begin with an airborne assault on the island. The opening phases of the campaign would involve a list of mistakes made by both sides. On the German side, this started with the German intelligence groups having completely misunderstood the size of the British defending force on the island. The intelligence that they had also pointed towards the idea that the British were in the process of abandoning Crete entirely and that the Cretan civilians would happily welcome the Germans when they arrived. Both of these ideas were completely incorrect and would serve to reinforce the underestimation of the defenders and the strength of their resistance. But any mistakes on the German side were met with British mistakes that would be even more impactful for the overall course of the fighting. Mistakes that we will spend this episode and several episodes in the future discussing. Dawn on May 20th would begin just like many other days had started on Crete since the New Zealand troops around Maleme had arrived on the island. At around 7:30 a.m., an alert was sent out that an enemy air raid was inbound, but this was routine by this point, with dawn German air attacks having taken place over the previous days as well. As one soldier would write, quote, "So accustomed were the troops to the daily hate that as soon as the planes disappeared out to sea, the men began to move to breakfast, which had been cooking during the raid." End quote. But unlike on other days, this was not the end of the German air raids, and another wave would arrive to hit the British positions again, to try and disrupt them, while at the same time the airborne transports and the gliders that they towed were on their way as well. There was a brief interlude between the final wave of ground attack aircraft and the transports and gliders arriving, which one man would describe as an eerie silence. As the Ju-52s and gliders came in over Crete, there were many different receptions waiting for them, depending on where specifically they were targeting. In the early moments of the attack, some would experience almost no resistance, and would be able to land and organize without any threat. In other areas, they would be under fire even before the men left the aircraft. This difference in experience was largely because the British had not been affected by the pre-drop air attacks, and therefore as soon as the slow transports came within range, the British gunners opened fire. And the only thing that could really save the German transports from this reception was luck, based on where they were dropping their troops or where the glider was trying to land. The German transports came in at very low altitude during this time as well, around 400 feet, which meant that some of the larger anti-aircraft guns actually could not shoot at them as they were designed for higher flying targets. But the slow-moving transports made easy targets for the Bofors 40mm anti-aircraft guns that opened up and began firing as rapidly as possible. In some cases, it turned into a target shoot, because the slow speed of the transports just made them easy targets. It wasn't just the anti-aircraft guns that would join in the firing, and even just infantry machine guns that could be pointed at the gliders and then at the paratroopers as they jumped would join in the fighting. The light machine guns were more than enough to cause horrible damage to the light gliders as they tried to make their landings, and the German paratroopers made a good target on their way down. First of all, some of the chutes were color-coded to denote what they were carrying. Pink or violet parachutes were officers, and weapon containers were white parachutes, and so they were very noticeable. There was also the fact that once the German paratroopers were out of the aircraft, the German parachutes could not be controlled in any way because of the design of the harness that was used. It attached to a harness in the middle of the jumper's back, and this limited the ability of the German paratroopers to control anything about the path of their drop. This meant that in some cases, the German paratroopers were placed on full display for the New Zealand infantry to just blaze away. Shooting the defenseless soldiers on their way down, under their canopies was certainly unsporting, something that was noted by some of the New Zealanders that took part. However, sometimes war is unfair, and so shot the Germans were. Officers went among the men to ensure that they were accounting for the drop with their shooting, giving guidance to aim for the boots of the German soldiers because that was roughly where you needed to aim to actually hit the body. The Germans that actually managed to touch the ground could also find themselves on top of the defenders' positions, or just right in front of their guns, which often resulted in an early death. The individual losses were bad enough for the Germans, but it would also cause growing issues as more and more transports came in over the areas around Maleme. With the Bofors blazing away at the transports and other weapons tearing apart the gliders, the tendency of pilots was to disperse out of sort of defensive instinct, just, out of sheer self-preservation. This would result in many of the German forces being widely dispersed over their drop areas, and this meant that instead of landing in tight groups and quickly moving towards their objectives, they had to take a long time. Sometimes it would take hours to come together as units before they could move off and do whatever they were supposed to be doing. While the initial stages of the invasion were disastrous for some of the German units involved, dropping right on top of the defenders' positions, there were many drops and landings that occurred just as expected. The key to the entire German strategy at Maleme was to capture the airfield and then use it as a place to land further reinforcements for later fighting. This had influenced not just the drop strategy, but also the air attack strategy in the hours and days before the attack, with the German bombers being careful to avoid damaging the runway. There were also multiple areas around the airfield where the attackers were trying to position their forces that would give them the best advantage in the fighting ahead. And while it was unfortunate that some of the men involved found themselves right in the line of fire, the good news from the German perspective was that many of their forces were able to reach the ground successfully and then begin to launch attacks on the British. Most of the successful German landings were near the Tavronitis River, which was on the west side of the airfield. The Germans had targeted this area because it was beyond the largest concentration of British defenders, but more importantly, the river provided a large area of ground that was completely protected from the British fire closer to the airfield. More importantly, these forces on the river were not immediately under threat from any attack, and this gave them time to land, catch their breath, and start to organize. This was critical because just like when facing an amphibious attack, the weakest moment for any airborne operation is immediately when the landings are occurring. At that moment, between when the first boots hit the ground and when the paratroopers start to gather together and organize, is just a point of extreme weakness. During those moments, individual men are very vulnerable, and therefore fast counterattacks against any landings are the key to defending against such attacks. This was known to the British and New Zealand troops. In fact, the British had captured a German parachute training manual during one of the earlier campaigns of the war, and therefore fully understood how weak the Germans were at the moment of landing and had planned to launch counterattacks. And they would happen in some areas, but the areas on the west side of the Tavronitis were just outside of the ability of the defenders to disrupt them and to launch those counterattacks. Instead, the German units there were formed up and began to work on their objectives. First up was securing the bridge over the Tavronitis, and then slowly probing the airfield's defenses for any signs of weaknesses. While those objectives were being pursued, forces were also assembled to assault Hill 107, a critical piece of ground that the Germans needed to hold on to if they wanted to launch a series of assaults on the airfield and if they wanted to start landing transports on the airfield as soon as possible. Hill 107, which importantly provided an overlooking position on the airfield, was defended by C and D Company of the 22nd New Zealand Battalion. During the early moments of the battle, they had been perfectly positioned to absolutely shred German gliders with their machine guns. Many of the slow lumbering transports and gliders had flown right over the top of their positions, which in some cases made it difficult to miss. They had also been able to inflict serious casualties on the German attackers after they had landed, and they had been keeping a steady fire on any Germans that appeared during the early hours of the attack. In the upcoming fight, D Company, made up of around 75 men and some machine guns, would be the most directly in the path of the German attack, as they were positioned on the western side of the hill, making them the most forward unit of the defense. This was one of the primary reasons that they had been in such a good position to shoot at the landings, as they were able to overlook the Tavronitis River. But their luck was about to turn as the German forces began to push forward. It did not start with an immediate attack on the hill, but instead there would be a multi-step process whereby the bridge over the river was captured, then the push towards the airfield continued, then a battalion of forces were sent around to the southern side of Hill 107 to begin the push forward in that area. Problems began to mount quickly for the defenders on the hill, as they were suddenly under attack from multiple different directions. To make matters worse, one of the things that the Germans had managed to land safely were mortars, which had been brought in via glider and had been set up to the west of the Tavronitis River. These mortars now turned their fire against the defenders of Hill 107. C and D Company would keep fighting, but Colonel Andrew, responsible for the defense of the airfield, would soon lose communication with them.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile with a message for everyone paying big wireless way too much. Please, for the love of everything good in this world, stop. With Mint, you can get premium wireless for just $15 a month. Of course, if you enjoy overpaying, no judgments, but that's weird. Okay, one judgment. Anyway, give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. Intro rate first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See full terms at mintmobile.com.
¿Hablas español?
Sprichst du Deutsch?
Komm du Norsk?
If you used Babbel, you would. Babbel's conversation-based techniques teaches you useful words and phrases to get you speaking quickly about the things you actually talk about in the real world, with lessons handcrafted by over 200 language experts and voiced by real native speakers. Babbel is like having a private tutor in your pocket. Start speaking with Babbel today. Get up to 55% off your Babbel subscription right now at babbel.com/Spotify. Spelled BABBEL.com/Spotify. Rules and restrictions may apply.
On the British side, many of the command decisions to try and deal with the German attack on Maleme fell to Colonel Andrew, the commander of the New Zealand 22nd Battalion, which was charged with the defense of the airfield and the areas around it. In total, he would have about 600 men under his command, along with the support of 2 Matilda tanks of the 7th Royal Tank Regiment. While his troops would do a good job of putting fire on the Germans as they approached their landing areas, and then immediately when they hit the ground, as soon as enough German forces successfully landed and got organized, Andrew immediately had problems. The territory under his command was around the airfield and then Hill 107, which overall encompassed about 5 square kilometers of territory. But this territory was heavily uneven, and it had many vineyards, olive trees, and was just generally not an easy set of ground to defend. This became a major problem, or a major set of problems, as soon as these small groups of paratroopers began probing forward, and particularly after they were able to secure the bridge over the Tavronitis and began to spread out to probe the airfield's defenses from multiple different angles. While there were defending forces along most of the perimeter, the terrain made it difficult to ensure that the German units were engaged before they were right on top of the defenses, and that they did not find a way through them as well. Soon after the fighting started, reports started to come in, not just of German attacks along the western side of the defenses towards the Tavronitis, but also from the north, where a platoon of New Zealanders, with barely more than 20 men, was able to hold back a determined German attack. Unfortunately, a separate German effort was able to find a way into the British camp, where they had pitched their tents and had their supplies, and the Germans would be able to force the British defenders out of this area. Within the camp, the Germans were able to get their hands on some supplies as well as a wealth of information, including an up-to-date codebook and a complete order of battle for every British unit on Crete. But somehow, this was not even the biggest problem that Andrew had to deal with. Along the western side and the most threatened area of the airfield, the forces in the defensive line very quickly started asking for help, with one company commander even directly requesting the assistance of the Matilda tanks. Andrew was hesitant to commit all of his reserve too early, and he instead hoped that he would be able to get some assistance from the nearby 23rd Battalion, which was positioned further to the east, but also knew that it might be called upon to provide that assistance. There was a major problem, though, and it was revolving around the radio. Andrew and his men had already had some issues with their radios before the battle started, and those issues would also be present after the Germans landed. He would later say that he was, quote, handicapped by hopelessly bad communications, end quote. And this would result in him finding it more and more difficult to operate his battalion as a unit or even really understand what was happening. Not only did it impact his ability to communicate and coordinate his units, it would also mean that he would be unable to properly communicate with the 23rd Battalion or anybody else. Now, there was a plan for this. Wireless radios were at times temperamental, so there was always a backup plan. And in this case, the plan was to send up white and green flares, which when combined would be considered to be an emergency signal that the 23rd would interpret as the 22nd needing immediate assistance. Unfortunately, the flares were not spotted by the 23rd. After many more attempts, radio communication was established with the 23rd Battalion, only to learn that they could not send assistance because they were also engaged by the Germans. There is some doubt that these attacks were actually occurring or that the 23rd was under any direct threat at this time, but in this case, the truth doesn't necessarily matter. Because for Andrew, finding out that no help was coming left him with seemingly very few options. And so he decided to do what seemed like the only thing he could do, which was send in the Matildas. The two tanks, which would be supported by a platoon of troops partially made up of men from the anti-aircraft guns, had the goal of pushing west, with the goal of making it to the Tavronitis riverbed. What would follow can best be described as a bit of a debacle, and perhaps a great example of why British armor performance often fell short of expectations during several actions during the early years of the war. One of the Matildas would quickly discover that they could not traverse their turret, and they had loaded the wrong ammunition. So that tank turned around and went back to the starting point. The other tank would continue to move to the bridge over the riverbed, only to then get stuck on a boulder, at which point they also discovered that the turret could not traverse. All they could do was abandon the tank and retreat, along with some of the infantry that had been able to move forward with them. It was just a failure all around, and when Andrew found out, he let the 23rd know that unless they could send support, he would very likely have to give up the airfield. He was promised 2 companies, but also told that if he had to withdraw, then it's just what he would have to do. Andrew was in a genuinely tight spot by this point. He knew that his forces were at the end of the British line, and that he was under a risk of being overrun by superior German forces. And the situation was not great by the early evening hours of May 20th, that was very clear. But they were not as dire as he feared. C and D companies, the most important for his defense, protecting both the airfield and Hill 107, were still fighting. They were not in a great situation, but they were still fighting. Even as Andrew was making the final decision to give up the airfield, if he had gone out of his command post and tried to visit the lines, he would have seen their continued resistance. However, his decision-making process did not really involve that kind of experience, and it would be the first in a long line of British command decisions made by British officers on Crete where they immediately began to fear the worst as soon as anything bad would end up happening. He would therefore choose to order a withdrawal from Maleme. One of the themes that I constantly come back to in this podcast is the mindset that we as modern-day individuals have to get into when trying to understand why some decisions were made in the past. This decision by Colonel Andrew is one of those because the key piece of information that he was missing was the current state of the British forces around the airfield, because they did not have a wireless radio set. This meant that the only way for him to really know what was happening to C and D companies and other forces was to actually get out there and make a trip, or to get reports delivered by runners, and they were not very consistent with their ability to actually make the trip back and forth from the front lines. The result of this information vacuum would be Andrew taking the most pessimistic view of the situation, eventually resulting in his decision to retreat. However, those defending units not only were still resisting, they thought they were doing pretty well. And in fact, when orders began to arrive at the front that the men were going to withdraw, there was some surprise. Captain Campbell of D Company, and therefore one of the most exposed units around Maleme, refused to believe that the order had been given. Now, part of this was just luck, with Campbell's unit having been one of the lucky ones that had not been hard pressed and was still largely intact, but it wasn't like he didn't hear what was happening around him or didn't have at least some basic understanding of the situation. But it didn't matter, because those were the orders that had been given. The first area to be given up was Hill 107, where D Company was stationed, and unfortunately many of the forwardmost positions either would not receive the news or would get the news late. Fortunately, most of the men would get the news at some point during the night and would be able to use the darkness to pull back, leaving Hill 107 completely in German hands by first light on the 21st. Communications with C Company on the airfield were just as bad, and the company commander, Captain Johnson, would not even receive any information about the withdrawal until the early hours of the morning. This left very little time for news to be distributed and for plans to be made to pull back from the front. Captain Johnson, much like Captain Campbell, did not necessarily think that withdrawal was the option, because even if C Company was heavily pressed, even a single British machine gun on or near the airfield would be critical if the Germans started to try and land troops by air the next morning, which was exactly what they were going to do. Ju-52s could not hang out on the airfield and let reinforcements get off the plane if they were constantly under fire, even by light machine guns. Johnson understood this fact, but his hands were tied because as the other units under Andrew's command began to pull back, C Company just became more and more exposed to a German assault. If they waited until dawn, it was likely they would just be the targets for mass Luftwaffe bombing in the early morning light, and then an attack by whatever was left of the German paratroopers. And so Johnson also ordered his men to start pulling back just after 4 a.m. They would pull back to some trees during the dawn hours, so they would not be spotted by the early morning Luftwaffe flights before continuing their retreat to the east. There are many historians who claim that this was the moment that the Battle of Crete was lost. This single decision by the commander of an exposed and threatened New Zealand battalion. I generally don't skew to such judgments, and there would be many more mistakes the British would make in the days that followed, but it was certainly good for the Germans that they would shortly have Maleme under their control, or at least under their control enough to start landing reinforcements. That control did not come for free, though, and the early waves of paratroopers that had attacked the British positions around Maleme were, in some cases, almost completely destroyed. What Colonel Andrew could not have known at that fateful moment on May 20th, 1941, that we know today, is how close the German paratroopers were to complete failure at Maleme. If he had just held onto the airfield a little bit longer, if he just kept those first set of Ju-52s that would land on the 21st off of the airfield, it could have been a disaster for the Germans. Already on the evening of the 20th, there were discussions happening in Greece and in Berlin about giving up the entire attack because of how poorly the opening day's offensive had gone. But that's not what would happen. Andrew would give them just the smallest of windows, just on the western side of the airfield where they could land their transports, and it would all cascade from there. But before we get to that moment, we also have to talk about all of the other attacks that would happen on May 20th, all along Crete, and we'll start covering those next episode.